I walked into that office on a Tuesday morning thinking it would be just another day of swallowing my pride and pretending everything was fine. Instead, I walked out 30 minutes later having delivered the most satisfying resignation speech of my professional life. And when my phone started ringing 3 days later with increasingly desperate voicemails from my former boss, I realized I had just triggered the most beautiful corporate meltdown I'd ever witnessed. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago I watched a company that treated me like disposable garbage literally beg me to save them from the disaster they created by pushing me too far. Before I tell you exactly how sweet it felt to watch them panic while I sipped coffee in my pajamas, could you do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button? Because what I'm about to share will show you that sometimes the best revenge is simply walking away and letting people experience the consequences of their own terrible decisions. Trust me, you need to hear every detail of how this unfolded because it's going to change how you think about your own worth in the workplace forever. Let me take you back to where this really started. Because the most satisfying revenge stories always begin long before the actual revenge happens. 18 months ago, I joined Meridian Solutions as their operations coordinator, a fancy title that basically meant I was responsible for making sure nothing fell through the cracks while everyone else got credit for the smooth operation I maintained behind the scenes. The job description made it sound challenging but manageable. 40 hours a week coordinating between departments, maintaining client databases, and ensuring project timelines stayed on track. What they didn't mention was that the previous person in my position had lasted exactly 6 months before having what my supervisor called a stress-related breakdown. And now I understand why. My boss, Kevin Hartwell, was one of those people who believed that micromanagement was a leadership style and that creating artificial urgency was the same thing as motivating employees. He was the kind of manager who would send emails marked urgent at 9 p.m. about meetings that could have been scheduled next week, then act confused when people seemed stressed. From day one, he made it clear that he considered my role a necessary evil, something that had to exist but shouldn't require much attention or resources. But I saw something different in those first few weeks when I reviewed our operational systems. What I found was a patchwork of outdated processes, missed communications, and client relationships that were hanging by threads because nobody had been paying attention to the details that actually mattered. Projects were consistently running over deadline, departments were working with conflicting information, and our client satisfaction scores were dropping month after month, while leadership focused on sales numbers and ignored the operational foundation that made those sales sustainable. So I started doing something that seemed radical in that environment. I began treating our operations like they actually mattered. I created comprehensive tracking systems that showed exactly where projects stood at any given moment. I established regular communication protocols between departments so that everyone was working with the same information. I built relationships with our key clients, learning their preferences and anticipating their needs before problems arose. I stayed late, came in early, and spent weekends developing solutions to problems that had been plaguing the company for years. Within 6 months, our project completion rate had improved by 40%. Client complaints had dropped to almost nothing, and departments that used to operate in silos were actually collaborating effectively. The company was running smoother than it had in years, but Kevin never understood what I was actually doing. He would walk past my workstation and see me on lengthy phone calls with clients, and I could feel his disapproval radiating across the office space. During our monthly reviews, he would flip through my activity reports with visible frustration, commenting that I seemed to be spending too much time on relationship maintenance and not enough time on what he called core operational tasks. I tried explaining that the relationship maintenance was preventing the fires we used to spend all day putting out, that the time I invested in communication was saving hours of confusion and rework down the line, but Kevin only cared about metrics that fit his understanding of productivity, and long conversations with clients didn't translate into numbers he could easily quantify. What he didn't realize was that I was becoming the invisible backbone of the entire operation. when the marketing department needed to understand client preferences for a new campaign. They called me. When sales needed to know realistic timelines for project delivery, they bypassed Kevin entirely and came straight to my desk. When our biggest client had concerns about service quality, they specifically requested to speak with me because they knew I would actually listen and follow through. Month after month, I watched our operational efficiency climb, while Kevin remained focused on surface-level metrics that completely missed the point. He was measuring how quickly we processed individual tasks, while I was building the systems that made those tasks unnecessary in the first place. The breaking point came during our annual performance review meeting. I walked into Kevin's office expecting recognition for the measurable improvements our department had achieved, maybe even a discussion about expanded responsibilities or professional development opportunities. Instead, he spent 45 minutes lecturing me about time management and efficiency optimization. He pulled up a spreadsheet showing average call times and pointed out that my client interactions were consistently longer than what he considered optimal. He suggested that I was probably socializing too much during business calls, and that I needed to focus on more streamlined communication methods. Then he showed me a comparison chart indicating that other operations coordinators at similar companies processed more transactions per day, completely ignoring the fact that our client retention rate had reached an all-time high and our internal coordination issues had virtually disappeared. But the moment that changed everything was when he announced my new performance goals for the upcoming year. He wanted me to reduce average client interaction time by 30%, increase transaction processing speed by 25%, and take on additional administrative duties that would essentially eliminate my ability to maintain the relationships and systems that were actually driving our success. It was like asking a chef to cook faster by spending less time on ingredients and seasoning, then wondering why the food quality declined. I realized in that moment that Kevin didn't just misunderstand my contributions. He was actively working to dismantle the very things that were making our department successful. He was so focused on optimizing individual metrics that he couldn't see the bigger picture of how those metrics connected to create sustainable operational excellence. After that meeting, I started paying attention to company dynamics in a different way. I noticed that Kevin took credit for our improved performance numbers in leadership meetings, without mentioning the operational changes that had driven those improvements. I watched him present my client relationship strategies as his own innovations, while simultaneously pressuring me to abandon those same strategies for the sake of efficiency metrics. I began documenting everything, not because I was planning anything specific, but because I could feel the situation becoming unsustainable and I wanted to protect myself if things went sideways. What I discovered was that Kevin had been systematically taking credit for every operational improvement I had implemented while publicly criticizing my methods as inefficient. In email chains with upper management, he described our success as the result of his streamlined management approach and strategic oversight, never mentioning that the actual improvements came from relationship building and systematic problem solving that he had consistently opposed. The final straw came on a Monday morning in late autumn when Kevin called an all-hands department meeting to announce what he called a comprehensive operational restructuring initiative. He had apparently spent the weekend developing a new system that would eliminate what he described as redundant relationship maintenance activities and focus our efforts on pure transaction efficiency. Standing in front of our entire team, he outlined a plan that would essentially destroy every improvement I had spent 18 months building. Client interactions would be limited to 15 minutes maximum. Relationship maintenance calls would be eliminated entirely, and all communication would follow standardized scripts designed to maximize processing speed. He presented this as a revolutionary approach to operational excellence, completely oblivious to the fact that he was describing a return to the exact problems that had plagued the company before I arrived. But what made it truly infuriating was the way he framed the changes. He talked about eliminating inefficiencies and optimizing human resources, using corporate buzzwords to disguise the fact that he was about to destroy the foundation of our recent success because it didn't fit his narrow understanding of productivity. Then he looked directly at me and said that some team members might need time to adjust to more efficient operational methods, but that resistance to change was simply a symptom of outdated thinking. I felt heat spreading across my neck as my colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He was publicly humiliating me for the crime of making our department successful in ways he didn't understand. But then he did something that crossed a line I never expected him to cross. He announced that effective immediately, I would be transitioned to a new role focused exclusively on data entry and transaction processing, with no client contact and no involvement in strategic operational decisions. My relationship-building responsibilities would be distributed among other team members who would follow his new efficiency protocols. He was essentially demoting me while making it sound like a lateral move, stripping away everything that had made my job meaningful and effective while forcing me to watch him dismantle the systems I had built. The meeting ended with polite applause from people who looked like they were attending a funeral, and I walked back to my desk feeling like I had just watched someone set fire to my professional life. But as I sat there staring at my computer screen, something shifted inside me. I wasn't devastated anymore. I was calculating. Kevin had just made a series of assumptions that were about to cost him more than he could possibly imagine. He assumed that I would accept the demotion quietly rather than cause drama. He assumed that the operational improvements would continue without my involvement because he didn't understand what had actually created them. Most importantly, he assumed that I needed this job more than this job needed me. He was wrong on all three counts, and I was about to show him exactly how wrong in the most satisfying way possible. That night I went home and did something I hadn't done in months. I updated my resume, but not because I was desperate to escape, because I was finally ready to let Kevin learn some very expensive lessons about the difference between managing metrics and managing operations. The next morning, I walked into that office knowing it would be my last day, and Kevin's smug expression when he saw me arrive was about to become the most expensive facial expression of his professional career. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was anxious about what I was planning to do, but because I kept thinking about all the ways Kevin's new system was going to fail spectacularly once the person who actually understood our operations was no longer there to hold everything together. I arrived at the office early, not to get ahead on work I'd never finish, but to prepare for the most satisfying conversation of my professional life. Kevin strolled in around 9:30 with his usual coffee and that self-satisfied expression of a man who believed he had successfully optimized another human being into submission. He walked past my desk without acknowledgement, probably expecting me to be quietly accepting my new data entry role and mentally preparing to watch him destroy 18 months of operational improvements. Instead, I was printing out my resignation letter and gathering the personal items that actually mattered to me. At exactly 10 a.m., I knocked on his office door. He looked up from his computer with mild irritation, probably wondering why I wasn't already focused on my diminished responsibilities. I placed my resignation letter on his desk and said the words I had been rehearsing since the moment he announced my demotion. "Kevin, effective immediately. I'm resigning from my position at Meridian Solutions. My last day is today." He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the directness of my announcement. "You can't just quit without notice," he stammered, his usual corporate confidence suddenly shaky. "There are protocols, transition procedures, knowledge transfer requirements." "Actually," I replied, pulling out my employee handbook and pointing to Section 12, hostile work environment provisions allow for immediate resignation when job duties are substantially altered without consent as a form of constructive dismissal. Yesterday's demotion qualifies under both legal definitions. His face flushed as he realized I had done my homework. "This is completely unprofessional," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You're abandoning your responsibilities and leaving the team in a difficult position." "I'm not abandoning anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply declining to continue in a role that no longer matches my job description, qualifications, or professional standards." You made it clear yesterday that my approach to operations doesn't align with your vision, so I'm removing myself from the equation. He tried a different approach, leaning back in his chair and adopting the condescending tone he used when he wanted to remind people who was in charge. Look, Sarah, I understand you're upset about the restructuring, but this is a business decision based on operational efficiency. If you'll just give the new system a chance, you might find that it's actually an improvement. I smiled the kind of smile you give someone who is about to walk off a cliff while insisting they can fly. Kevin, I said, your new system is going to fail within 2 weeks. Your client satisfaction scores are going to plummet, and your department coordination is going to collapse back into the chaos it was before I arrived. But that's not my problem anymore. His expression shifted from condescension to something that looked almost like panic. You're being dramatic, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. These are proven efficiency methods. Operational excellence doesn't depend on any single person. We'll see, I replied, standing to leave. Good luck with your transaction processing metrics. As I walked toward the door, he called after me with what sounded like desperation creeping into his voice. You're making a huge mistake, Sarah. You'll never find another position that offers this level of responsibility and growth potential. I paused at the doorway and turned back to face him one last time. Kevin, within a month, you're going to realize that responsibility and growth potential are meaningless when you don't understand what actually makes a business function. Then I walked out of his office, collected my personal belongings, and headed for the exit while 23 pairs of eyes watched me leave with expressions that ranged from shock to admiration to barely concealed envy. The security guard who buzzed me out smiled and said quietly, "Good for you." And I realized that everyone had been watching Kevin's management style with the same frustration I had been feeling. By the time I reached my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I was free from a bad job, but because I was about to watch natural consequences unfold in real time, while Kevin learned some very expensive lessons about the difference between optimizing systems and destroying them. The first sign that Kevin's confidence was misplaced came exactly 6 hours after I left the building. My phone buzzed with a text from my former colleague Marcus, who had always been supportive of my operational methods, even when Kevin dismissed them. The message was short, but telling, already falling apart, clients calling asking where you are, Kevin in emergency meetings all afternoon. I didn't respond because I wasn't interested in workplace gossip, but I was curious about how quickly the foundation I had built would start cracking once the person who understood its architecture was no longer there to maintain it. The answer was faster than even I had anticipated. By Wednesday morning, Marcus was sending me screenshots of increasingly frantic email chains where Kevin was trying to figure out why client response times had suddenly tripled and why departments that had been collaborating smoothly were now sending conflicting information to external partners. The beautiful irony was that Kevin's new efficiency protocols were creating exactly the kind of operational chaos they were supposed to prevent. And he was discovering that transaction speed meant nothing when the transactions themselves were based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Thursday brought the first direct contact from Kevin himself, a formal email sent to my personal account with the subject line, "Urgent clarification needed regarding operational procedures." The message was carefully worded to sound professional, but I could read the underlying desperation between the lines. He needed information about client preferences, project coordination methods, and communication protocols that he had never bothered to understand while I was implementing them. I didn't respond to that email either, not out of spite, but because any information I provided would just be a temporary bandage on problems that required systematic understanding to solve permanently. Kevin had made it clear that he didn't value my approach to operations, so he could figure out his own approach to fixing the mess his efficiency optimization had created. Friday afternoon brought something even more satisfying. A voicemail from Kevin that he had clearly left without thinking through the implications of what he was saying. "Sarah, this is Kevin. I hope you're doing well. Listen, We're experiencing some transitional challenges with the new operational structure, and I was hoping you might be available for some consulting work to help smooth out the implementation process. We'd be willing to pay competitive consulting rates for your expertise. The irony was absolutely delicious. The same man who had demoted me for inefficiency was now offering to pay me consulting rates to fix the problems his efficiency improvements had created. But what made it even better was that he was calling it transitional challenges and implementation issues, instead of admitting that his fundamental understanding of our operations had been completely wrong. I saved the voicemail, but didn't return the call because I was having too much fun watching the situation develop naturally. Over the weekend, I received 3 more messages, each one slightly more desperate than the last. And by Monday morning, Kevin was leaving voicemails that sounded like a man who had just realized he was drowning in consequences he never saw coming. The breakthrough moment came on Tuesday when my phone rang with a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Margaret Chen, the company's regional director and Kevin's supervisor. Her voice was professional but strained when she asked if I would be available for a confidential conversation about my departure from Meridian Solutions. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and Margaret's first words were an apology that Kevin should have delivered months earlier. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because I think we both value honesty over corporate diplomacy. Kevin's operational restructuring has been a disaster. Our client satisfaction scores have dropped 28% in 1 week, and 3 major accounts have already expressed concerns about service quality changes." She leaned forward, her expression serious but respectful. "I've spent the last few days reviewing performance data from before and after your departure, and it's clear that improvements we attributed to departmental efficiency were actually the result of your individual contribution to operational excellence. What Kevin called redundant relationship maintenance was actually the foundation of our client retention and interdepartmental coordination. I appreciated her directness, but I was more interested in what she was building toward than what she was acknowledging about the past." Margaret continued, "We'd like to offer you a position as Director of Operations, reporting directly to me instead of through Kevin, with full authority over operational strategy and a 40% salary increase from your previous compensation." It was a generous offer, the kind of promotion and recognition I had hoped for during my entire tenure at Meridian Solutions. But it was also an offer that came only after Kevin's mismanagement had created a crisis that threatened the company's stability. Margaret seemed to understand my hesitation because she added, "I know this comes after you've been treated poorly, and I understand if you've lost faith in our company culture. But I also know that you built something valuable here, and I'd like to give you the authority and resources to build it even better." I told her I would consider the offer and get back to her within a few days, not because I was actually considering it, but because I wanted to see how desperate the situation would become before I made my final decision. What happened next exceeded my most optimistic expectations for Kevin's professional downfall. Wednesday morning brought a call from our biggest client, a manufacturing company that represented 30% of Meridian's annual revenue. The voice on the other end was polite but firm when he explained that they were terminating their contract due to what he called a significant decline in service quality and communication effectiveness. They had specifically requested to work with me on their upcoming expansion project, and when they learned I was no longer with the company, they decided to take their business to a competitor who could provide the personal attention and operational expertise they required. That single phone call represented a revenue loss of over $2 million annually, and it was directly tied to Kevin's decision to eliminate the relationship maintenance activities he had considered inefficient. By Thursday, Margaret was calling me twice a day with increasingly attractive offers, each one representing her growing desperation to fix the operational crisis that was threatening to destroy everything I had built over 18 months. The final offer was stunning. Director of Operations with a 60% salary increase, equity participation, complete autonomy over operational strategy, and the authority to restructure Kevin's role to focus on areas that better matched his actual competencies. It was everything I could have wanted 6 months earlier, but it was also proof that they had only learned to value my contributions after losing them had cost them millions of dollars in revenue and operational stability. Friday afternoon brought the most satisfying phone call of the entire experience. Kevin himself, calling from what sounded like a very quiet office, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I think I made some mistakes in how I handled the operational restructuring. I'm hoping we can find a way to bring you back to help us get things stabilized. The offer Margaret made, it's real, and you'd have my full support for whatever operational strategy you think works best." The irony was incredible. The same man who had publicly humiliated me for inefficiency was now admitting that his efficiency improvements had been mistakes and offering me his full support to implement the exact approaches he had previously criticized. But what made it even more satisfying was the tone of his voice, not the arrogant confidence of a manager who thought he knew better, but the desperate pleading of someone who had just learned the difference between measuring productivity and understanding operations. I listened to his entire speech without interrupting, then said simply, "Kevin, I appreciate you calling, but I've decided to move in a different direction professionally. Thank you for the learning experience." 6 months later, I'm running operations for a consulting firm that understood the value of relationship building and systematic thinking from day one. My new position offers everything Meridian eventually tried to give me, but with leadership that values operational excellence because they understand what creates it, not because a crisis forced them to acknowledge its importance. Meanwhile, Margaret sends me occasional updates about Meridian's ongoing challenges. Apparently, Kevin was eventually transferred to a role that better matched his actual skills, and they hired an external consultant to rebuild the operational systems I had originally created. The consultant's report specifically cited the relationship maintenance and interdepartmental coordination protocols I had developed as best practices for sustainable operational excellence. The company survived Kevin's efficiency optimization, but it took them 8 months and over $3 million in lost revenue to get back to the performance levels they had achieved when I was quietly doing my job without recognition or adequate compensation. The most satisfying part wasn't the vindication or the improved career opportunities that followed my resignation, though both were gratifying. The most satisfying part was knowing that Kevin had created his own professional crisis. By refusing to understand the difference between optimizing metrics and optimizing outcomes, he could have learned from my methods, supported my innovations, and taken credit for department improvements, while allowing me to continue building operational excellence. Instead, he chose to dismantle systems he didn't understand and learned the hard way that efficiency without effectiveness is just expensive chaos. Every time someone asks me about dealing with management that doesn't appreciate their contributions, I tell them about the Tuesday morning I walked into Kevin's office and resigned without notice. Not because quitting without notice is always the right answer, but because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop preventing people from experiencing the natural consequences of their own bad decisions. Kevin thought he was optimizing operations when he was actually destroying them, and the most elegant response was to step aside and let him discover the difference between theory and reality. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting incompetent management face the results of their incompetence, while you build something better somewhere else, and watching them realize too late that they weren't managing a disposable employee. They were dismantling the foundation of their own success. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had a boss who didn't understand what you actually contributed until after you were gone, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Sometimes the best therapy for workplace frustration is sharing stories with people who understand what it feels like to be undervalued by people who should know better. And if you enjoyed hearing about how Kevin's efficiency optimization became his professional downfall, please like this video And subscribe for more stories about workplace situations where natural consequences create their own perfect justice.